Jugaad innovation is perhaps the dominant approach to innovation in India. Jugaad is a Hindi word which literally translates as an innovative fix or an ingenious improvised solution using limited resources. It's particularly dominant and widespread in emerging markets like India, where you have environments with very scarce resources and a lot of unpredictability. So we find it in India, but we also find it in China, in Brazil, in various African economies. Interestingly, we also see evidence of Jugaad in the early industrial period in the West. And we also find that there are companies now in the West that are very interested in bringing this back into their toolkit. Perhaps the most interesting example we use of Jugaad in an Indian context is of a person from a rural part of India in Gujarat, which suffered an earthquake in the early 2000s. And out of that adversity came a lot of innovation from this particular person without using a lot of resources. So he noticed that, for instance, mud pots had been used traditionally by people to cool water, and he got the idea from that to actually develop a fridge which didn't require electricity, but just used clay, in which people could store fruit and veg, but just using the cooling properties of water to keep it fresh. Jugaad innovation seems to be in sort of a diametric sort of opposition to the dominant structured approach to innovation that we see in the West. Big R&D budgets, planned approaches to innovation, and innovation done in a somewhat insular way by people whose job is to innovate. Whereas Jugaad is frugal, it's flexible, and it's quite democratic. However, we start to see that in the West, quite large companies, but also entrepreneurs are increasingly interested in Jugaad, partly because they operate in emerging markets and they see that Jugaad is very effective in these emerging markets, but also because in the West they are facing resource constraints and unpredictability in the environment and see this frugal, flexible approach to innovation as being a very nice complement to more structured approaches to innovation. Perhaps the best example of a Western corporation that's using Jugaad and integrating it with its long-established structured approach to innovation is GE, in particular GE Healthcare. And in the book, what we've tried to do is to identify the underlying principles of Jugaad, the practices of Jugaad that innovators and entrepreneurs in emerging markets use. And we've identified 6 of them, such as, find opportunity in adversity, do more with less, keep it simple, think and act flexibly, etc. And we find that GE and GE Healthcare in particular has been applying each of these principles in different ways within its operations in emerging markets like India, but also increasingly back in the West, in the US and Western Europe. What we mean by follow the heart is really it's about passion and commitment, but it's also in a sense about intuition and going with your gut instincts based on experience as opposed to doing analysis and in that process becoming somewhat paralyzed. So it's about quick response based on experience, and it's about commitment and passion. And a classic example of a Western exemplar of that is Steve Jobs, who did precisely that in his remarkable career in Apple and elsewhere, and was a big advocate of following your heart. We spend a lot of time in the book, in every chapter where we talk about a particular principle of Jugaad, we spend some time making the case for why incorporating this principle and this particular aspect of Jugaad into the Western corporation would be important and indeed strategically a strategic imperative. So if you take the principle of do more with less, we argue that that kind of frugality is increasingly a strategic imperative for Western firms, not only to the extent that they operate in emerging markets where there are scarce resources, but increasingly in Western developed markets where we have scarcity of financial resources, scarcity of energy, and so forth. So we make a case for the strategic imperative for Western corporations to adopt these aspects of Jugaad. And then we give examples of specific Western corporations that are actually at the forefront of doing that and have benefited from it. I gave you the example of GE as one company that has done that systematically. In the book, we explore others, such as PepsiCo, for instance, again, driven by its CEO. Both in the case of GE as well as in PepsiCo, the CEO convinced that the way forward is for their large company to increasingly learn from their operations in emerging markets, how to bring in frugal ways to do processes, but also develop and commercialize products and services.